I will indeed present you a talk which is a bit different from things that I've presented in other conferences where I was talking specifically about the VNA collections and the work that we've been doing for the last year and a half. We could, of course, talk about that maybe later in more informal ways. So I decided more to take a bit of a distance from the work we are all doing in our day-to-day work with objects and both physical and digital objects, and take a bit of time to think about that notion of object. So I thought that, and especially since we've moved that keynote to the morning session as a kind of opening session, I think it's a bit like a yoga class, if you want. It's something where, you take a distance, you open up your mind, and you think a bit differently. At least that's my intention. I hope we will manage that. In fact, and the occasion to do that was first, of course, the proposal made by Gabriele to do this keynote lecture. But also the fact that we've been doing within the VNA a number of seminars to which some of you have participated about that notion of musical instruments in museums and, in a broader sense, also sonic objects in museums, where we've been collectively thinking not only about musical instruments, but in a broader sense about the presence of sound in museums and other objects also which have a sonic component, whether you are thinking about clocks and radios and design objects also, like telephones and computers now and iPads and all that, which are part of the VNA collection. And of course, it was a way of thinking about these objects in a broader sense, and then putting back the musical instruments in that larger frame. So this is, in a way, a step further about the notion of object, and it was also inspired by, in fact, my initial training was in philosophy, and so in a way I'm getting back to my original training. And you've probably heard about this more recent current in philosophy, a bit trendy, I must say, and used by many people, but I think it's interesting to dig a little bit into that and see what it can say to us. And it's called object-oriented ontology, or OOO, or OOO, as some people name it. It's a vast movement of philosophers who've been working on that theme for about 15 years, let's say. Actually, the opening lecture was, or conference took place in London at Goldsmiths College. I think it was in 1997, sorry. And one of the most interesting thinkers about that is Graham Harman, who is an American philosopher, interestingly teaching in an architecture school in California. And he has developed that idea of the object, of a new philosophical look at objects. So I'm basing my thinking on his work. In a way, it's a work in progress, I must say, so I'm still continue to search into that. And I will deliver some of those ideas that I found particularly interesting. And I forgive you, but please you will forgive me that I will be reading some of it. So we can now start. So Graham Harman, so the initiator of object-oriented ontology, states that philosophy has to deal with any kind of object. He uses the term object to refer to any entity that cannot be paraphrased in terms of either its components nor its effects. Or elsewhere, he states it as an object is more than its pieces and less than its effects. Thus, as a first of Harman's statement, we can say that anything can be an object. It's this idea of flat ontology also that is being used by several philosophers, where animal, people, furniture, even institutions are put on the same plane. The Royal College of Music is an object, the VNA is an object, the United Nations, the solar system, Sherlock Holmes, fictional objects in a way, digital tools, they're all objects. This has often been criticized and considered as a weakness of OOO. But I think in our case it's particularly relevant in museum circles. If you think of a museum storage or a digital database like Minim that we will be talking about, all objects are in a way equally relevant, considered as equivalent, whatever their type, their form, their size, their origin. And they're not confined to humanly made objects, if we think, of course, of collections like the ones of the Natural History Museum. And they don't need to have a physical existence, as we will be talking also about digital objects. A second idea of Harman is that objects are mysterious. They are deeper than their appearance to the human mind, and also deeper than their relations to each other, so that all contact between objects must be indirect or vicarious. This is because Harman makes a distinction between real objects withdrawn from our access and sensual objects that exist only for the observer, whether he's human or non-human. He further makes a distinction between objects and qualities, which is something that I will not have time to explain this time for this lecture, but which is, of course, also a very interesting and deep distinction. But if the real object withdraws from our knowledge, it is precisely because it cannot be defined neither by its components, which Harman calls undermining, nor its effects, which he calls overmining. And these are basically the two ways in which science describes its knowledge of reality. None of these ways manage to capture the essence of the substance of the object, the thing in itself, a concept which is an old concept in philosophy dating from Immanuel Kant, also used by phenomenology. Neither science nor philosophy can fully grasp the object, as there is always something that escapes it. Another way of saying is that the object cannot be replaced by knowledge. I find this a particularly striking, profound, and intellectually challenging idea, especially for museums. We live with the idea that all these objects we store in our institutions remain intrinsically mysterious and will always remain as such, no matter how much research we pursue on this. So how do we relate to these objects? Third statement, interesting for us, is that O places aesthetics at the center of its philosophy instead of epistemology. It acknowledges the idea that the only way to access objects is indirect, and that it is art which provides us a methodology for the understanding of the object in this non-literal manner, in a process which Harman describes as theatrical. He bases his analysis on a text by the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset, which he quotes: "Imagine the importance of a language or system of expressive signs whose function was not to tell us about things, but to present them to us in the act of executing themselves. Art is just such a language. A work of art affords the peculiar pleasure we call aesthetic by making it seem that the inwardness of things is open to us." Ortega names the basic process of this seems to be the metaphor, as that which creates a coincidence between two things that is more profound and decisive than any mere resemblance. Harman goes further by qualifying this relation as theatrical. When we are pretending to reach the real object, we act not as passive spectators, but as actors. The term refers specifically to the theater method and theory devised by the Russian theater director Konstantin Stanislavski, where the actor should try as much as possible to become the character it portrays. Stanislavski's motto was that acting was an art of experiencing rather than of representing. And aren't all our museums now seeking for the best and the right visitor's experience? This experience gains here a new meaning as a process of becoming one with the object, even if fictionally, by endorsing or adopting the qualities of the object. This inherently theatrical process is, in Harman's terms, produced directly by the ultimate mystery of the artwork, which requires human participation to replace a real object that is permanently lost in its own depth. Let's now look at what this means for museums. What Harman calls undermining, that is reducing the object to its elementary particles, obviously does not work for museum objects. We cannot reduce the object to an analysis of its materials and working principles. We can see that when we compare, for instance, an original object and its replica. But the opposite characterization presents similar problems. Overmining, or the mere considerations of the effects of the work, for instance, its political significance or its cultural impact, does not explain all of the work's substance, especially when the object is dormant, like museum objects often are. An object in storage, even though it can be examined by specialists by appointment or looked at digitally in a database and a website like Minim, produces less or at least different effects than an object on display. Moreover, if we only define objects through their effects, or their agency, to use, of course, another term used in philosophy and social science, it is hard to explain how the same objects produce different effects when transposed in another context and society while still remaining the same object. And this is precisely what happens in museums. Change already appears when an object is displaced from its original environment and brought into the museum. There is a physical change that happens due to the inevitable decay of its materials. Research on objects, new interpretations, new displays, digitizing, all these elements make that museums are in constant flux. And some people say that museum collections are better conceptualized as collections of processes rather than as collections of objects. So should we speak of object, of process? I think if we take this broader definition of objects, we can pursue that direction also. But in any case, it's a performance. Contemporary curator Jens Hoffmann conceives, quote, the exhibition as a stage in which the objects on display are performers. Harman would say that it's the viewer who is the actor. But in all cases, theater is there. Elsewhere, in fact, about a year ago at this conference in Edinburgh, I had already advocated the idea that museums were theatrical environments. This is not only true for the Contemporary Museum, which is reenacted performances, its spectacular exhibition design, immersive displays, its use of sound, smell, touch, or its symposium architecture, creating urban landmarks. This idea was already present in the 18th century, for instance, in Carl Friedrich Schinkel's design of the Altes Museum in Berlin. And I quote a researcher working on Schinkel's architecture drawings. Schinkel's sketch of the Altes interior demonstrates his intention to orchestrate, it's my accentuation, orchestrate the museum space as theatrical. He depicts the grand architectural institution as one which dignifies the passage of the museum viewer. So we can now see a new sense for this theatrical concept where the visitor is dignified to the rank of actor. And the museum is not only an orchestrated play, but becomes, in other researchers like Boris Groys' terms, using a concept devised by a famous composer that you all know, the museum becomes a Gesamtkunstwerk. From there, the drawing of Bayreuth, of course. This is not the Altes Museum in Berlin. So in this orchestrated Gesamtkunstwerk, that's the museum is now, what is then the place of the sonic object? First of all, what do we mean by sonic objects? Here is a sample of some sonic objects that you might find in the V&A's collection. I think this concept embraces not only objects whose primary function is to produce sound, as I said before, musical instruments, clocks, radios, but also those of which the sounding element is only part of their function, telephones or musical toys or computers, and even those which do not produce any sound at all, but evoke the presence of sound through pictorial representation, for instance. A painting of a musical scene, which you can see, well, in a way here, but we have others. A photograph of a famous composer or musician, which inevitably sparkles musical association. It also includes intangible objects, such as a musical work, which is nevertheless often linked to a physical object, such as a vinyl record or a score. And it could well be that triple O, drives us to think that all objects are sonic. When Harman uses the concept of black noise to qualify the qualities, in fact, emanating from objects, it is not a white noise of screeching, chaotic qualities demanding to be shaped by the human mind, but rather a black noise of muted objects hovering at the fringes of our attention. Black is the color of sonic noises that approaches silence, allowing emissions of but a few spikes in energy. As opposed to white noise, which contains all frequencies of sound, as you know, black noise is a specific type of emission, and it forms this kind of aura of the vanishing object that we are constantly chasing. So we could also think of sonic object as a particular type of object of which the black noise has become explicit. Originally, the term sonic object derives from the objet sonore, coined by composer and engineer Pierre Schaeffer in his famous Traité des objets musicaux. In short, it meant a sound disconnected from its source and heard by itself. This has been made possible through, of course, the invention of sound recording and sound reproduction, as this allowed for any sound to be played outside of its original context and without the presence of the source. From there derives the concept of acousmatic listening, that is, listening without any visible sense of the sound origin. And I quote here Michel Chillon, a French thinker, by isolating the sound from the audiovisual complex to which it initially belonged, it creates favorable conditions for reduced listening, which concentrates on the sound for its own sake as a sound object, independently of its causes or its meaning. Now, this concept of objet sonore has been very much discussed, and some people rather talk about event rather than object. But let me highlight a kind of creative aspect or vision about it, which is presented by a London-based artist and thinker. He's the director and founder of the Museum of Portable Sound. His name is John Cannonberg, and I won't go into details of this museum. Maybe you've heard of it. It's, in fact, a digital museum. It's a collection of sound, but which is organized as a museum with galleries and halls and all that. And the only way you can listen to this museum is by contacting the artist, the founder, who brings this museum to you. In fact, the museum exists only in one iPod or one iPhone, if you want, and he brings it to you and you listen to it. So I won't go into details, but this has led him to think about this connection between the source and the sound. And for him, of course, in the museum, we keep in some way or another the connection to the source. He distinguished between an object, such as a radio or a cuckoo clock, the sonic event generated by the operation of this object, and C, the recording of this sound. And for him, these elements are interdependent, and this will be, I think, a central issue also of the conference today. And as you can read, one of these conclusions is that the sound object is both a part of and independent from the source object. So if we look, and I will conclude with that, at how museum visitors look at this musical object, this sound object, and here we'll take the particular example of the musical instrument in museums, we know that visitors often ask, how can I hear it? The absence of sound generally causes frustration, which can be partially explained by the fact that the sound object, this B thing in Cannonsberg's description, is not just a quality or an attribute of the object. It's not like the color of the object, if you want, because it exists independently also. But both A, the object, and B, the sonic object, are part of a whole of this kind of real and hidden real object, which, and I quote another thinker about sound, Mr. O'Callaghan, which partake in complex happenings that include sounds as well as activities beyond sounds. And in the course of sounding, objects also vibrate, collide, transmit energy, change shape, cool off. In Harman's terms, this could be this, quote, permanent autonomous zone where objects are simply themselves, reducing us to hunters of objects and even non-lethal hunters, since objects can never be caught. Sonic objects exemplify at best the fact that the real object, in Triple O's term, is vanishing. In front of a musical instrument, we try to perform or act it, partly based on our remembrance of having all, at some point or another, played or touched a musical instrument in our life. But the difficulty is precisely to relate what we know from our personal experience of, for instance, playing an instrument to this mysterious object we see behind a glass case and which we will never be able to know fully. Elsewhere, I had stated also that among all museum objects, musical instruments are perhaps the most theatrical, and that this was due to the fact that these objects were originally meant to be staged, whether in a theater or at home, or in other contexts, in the church or whatever. But their display could rarely feature this theatricality, as well as the embodied relation to the musical instruments. We now understand why these elements are missing. If we go back to the concept of visitor as actor, this embodied relation perfectly makes sense. The actor's experience is a fully physical one, and if we want to allow the visitor to attain that object, or even become the object in Harman's terms, we need to provide tools that can do it. And this is again where the intangible and the tangible, the physical and the virtual could meet. What kind of tools, what kind of technology, what kind of processes or devices could then be imagined to recreate the emotional and physical experience of that instrument? How do we capture what some people call the magic of instruments, their rich emotional aura, or the sensual connections they sparkle? What kind of tactile relation could simulate, or evoke that of touching the musical instrument? And why do we do it, of course? What kind of educational purpose are we then pursuing as part of museums' aims of entertainment and knowledge development, as well as the enhancement of inclusivity, diversity, and accessibility? These are some of the issues that I guess will be raised also during our discussions today and on other occasions as well. It's a never-ending topic, and which hopefully will be enhanced by some of these philosophical insights. Thank you very much for your attention.